Pleasure to have you here with us today to discuss transformations amid tariff wars. So, as we all know, there have been a lot of tariff-related policy updates coming out of the Trump administration over the past couple of weeks. On the one hand, we see that these updates have put some pressure on growth, raised some of the trade and supply chain risks, and most importantly, created a lot of uncertainty and volatility when it comes to business and investment planning decisions. So it's against this context that we're having today's briefing, and our aim for today's briefing is to break down a couple of these complexities in terms of the tariff announcements, shed light on what you can expect over the next couple of months in terms of visioning scenarios for tariffs, drill down the impact of the tariffs in terms of key industries, and most importantly, we do want to leave you with some tangible insights and key takeaways that you can incorporate into your business planning cycles. So with that in mind, let me now introduce you to our panel for today, who will be covering some of these core insights. So by way of introduction, I'm Neha Anna Thomas. I'm an associate director with the economic analytics practice at Frost & Sullivan. I have the pleasure of moderating today's session, and I'll also be sharing a couple of key insights later on. I'm joined by my fellow economist, Ritu Parna, from the economic analytics team. She's our lead. She's been tracking some of these high-frequency data very closely and is responsible for a lot of the visioning scenarios that we're working with. On the industry side of things, let me introduce you to Muthuraman Ramasamy, or Ram. He's our vice president and global client leader at Frost & Sullivan and oversees the energy, industrial, and digital side of things. And from an automotive perspective, we're being joined by Joe Praveen from the mobility team at Frost & Sullivan, overseeing the disruptive foresights practice. So the panel assembled here today will be able to give you a better holistic picture of what tariffs and trade wars 2.0 mean, both in terms of an economic as well as industry outcomes. And that's what you're going to be seeing in terms of the agenda today. So let me take you through that quickly, what you can expect over the next 1 hour. Thank you. So we're going to be starting with some economic visioning scenarios because, of course, we have tariffs announced YTD today, but it's important for businesses to navigate some alternative tariff futures that could pan out over the next couple of months. We're going to be shedding light on some key global and country forecasts, moving over to Trump's 2.0's tariff policies and what that means in terms of impact on the global economy. Segueing particularly into tariff impact on the automotive and the industrial sectors. We'll finally conclude with some key economic and business outcomes that executives can take away in terms of what are some of the expectations we're seeing in terms of high frequency indicators and the like, which are critical for business planning. Moving over to risks and growth opportunities, because anytime there's a major disruption in the world economy, of course, there are multiple risks that businesses have to contend with, but we simultaneously also see a lot of growth opportunities arising. And concluding with some strategies that you can particularly incorporate into your planning cycles. So the way we would like to run this is perhaps have the presentation run over about 45 minutes and leave another 10 minutes towards the end to take any critical questions that you might have. So without further ado, what we'd like to do to start off the session is to launch an audience poll. So moving over to the next slide. So with the trade wars, what we see, of course, is that recession talk is again in the news, and it's only but expected because we see on the one hand, let's say firms cutting spending, and there's so much of uncertainty that we're working with. So we'd like to get our audience perspective on this in terms of what are your recessionary expectations for 2025? Do you see a global recession, a US recession, a China recession, or no recession? And this is a multiple choice. So if you have more than 2 options, answers, feel free to tag both.
And sharing the results with you. So as you can see, we have 100% of votes for the US recession and 50% of votes for the no recession. global recession and China recession have not been selected. Over to you, Neha.
So I do see this being fairly aligned with some of our expectations, but I'm going to hand it over to Ritu because I know she's run some of the hard numbers. So Ritu, your inputs here.
Sure. Thank you so much, Neha. So, yeah, of course, I mean, it's understandable that the US recession concerns are definitely prominent, given the current economic conditions, etc. If you look at the US economy, of course, high interest rates that have significantly impacted investment momentum. For instance, if you see the capex numbers, right, non-residential investment, that has also started to. So basically, we looked at the early 2025 numbers. We saw some sort of a deceleration happening over there as well. In the auto sector, also, I was reading that the automakers and the suppliers are holding off on making major capital decisions, etc. So they, of course, wait for any kind of long-term clarity on the trade policy. So yes, there is definitely some sort of, I would say, decision paralysis that we're seeing at the moment in the US. However, despite these challenges, our baseline scenario does not really predict for a full year recession for the US economy. We may witness quarters with near zero or a slightly negative growth, particularly Q2 or Q3, because these 2 quarters are going to be really crucial, not only for the US economy, but overall for the global economy. So we may see some sort of a growth slowing till near zero, etc. for the US economy in these 2 quarters, especially. But overall, the economy is expected to avoid full year contraction is what we are looking at. And yes, I do have a couple of slides around US outlook, global economic outlook that I intend to present today. But before that, I'd like to hand this back to you, Neha.
Thank you, Ritu, for that perspective. I think we can start with sort of straight away dive into the visioning scenarios and your data forecasts.
Thanks. So in this particular slide, so let's look at some of the key components of 2025 growth outlook. So if you look at the layout of the slide, what we have done is we have displayed the GDP growth projections on the right-hand side of the slide, where we have got 3 charts for you. So we will also talk about the GDP growth numbers of the key countries in the following slide. But before we do that, what we have here are the growth rates for the global economy, for advanced and for the emerging markets. And on the left, we have drawn out a few scenarios: a baseline scenario, a tariff or intensification scenario, and in addition to that, a tariff or easing scenario. So what are these scenarios and how have we sort of defined each one of them? So the baseline scenario is based on the current realities in terms of tariff implications or the tariff measures which have been already implemented, and also based on what's most likely to happen with regards to tariffs in the next few months. And when we look at the other 2 scenarios, they factor in potential risks and potential opportunities that are probably not playing out as yet, but could emerge as we progress in the year. So we are also keeping a close watch on those developments as well. So let's look at the baseline scenario and let's look at what we have kept in mind when drawing this particular scenario. So our baseline considers that the 25% tariff on auto and metals to continue. The baseline also considers China tariffs to continue and stay elevated at 100 plus percentage levels for few months from here. And this also applies to almost all the products, I think, except for medical supplies in China. So that's about China. And baseline also considers tariffs for Canada and Mexico that do not comply with the USMCA to continue. And I think this is about 40% of Canadian exports to the US. In addition to these tariffs, the baseline scenario also considers 10% blanket tariff on all countries. And we expect that the 90-day pause on the reciprocal tariffs to continue for some more time beyond the 90-day period. So what we are saying is, even though the reciprocal tariffs are expected to come back in Q3. We assume a continuation of 10% tariff on all countries. That includes countries in Europe, India, Japan, and the like for some more time. So that's how we have created or crafted our baseline scenario. And if you look at the other scenario, which is the tariff intensification scenario, we expect reinstatement of high reciprocal tariffs starting Q3. And the same intensification scenario also considers additional sectoral tariffs in addition to auto and metals, which have already got implemented. We are also potentially looking at additional sectoral tariffs in the ranges of 5 to 15% blanket tariffs for sectors such as pharma, for semicon, coming in Q3. So there is definitely a possibility for these kind of tariffs coming in Q3. So that's how we also kind of created the intensification scenario. And then in addition to these two, we also drew out a scenario called tariff war easing scenario, where we expect toned down or slightly muted reciprocal tariff imposition, perhaps below 10%, 5 to 10% levels of reciprocal tariff to continue starting Q3. And also some sort of a relaxations given to other sectors as well. So that's about the different layers of the scenario assumptions based on our current understanding. And before we look at the GDP growth projections that we have on the right, I'd like to move to the next slide, which gives us a visual representation, like a mapping of the key tariff measures and also the scenario assumptions for better clarity for our audience. So what we have here is, on the vertical axis, if you see, we have a likelihood meter. We are trying to map which of the measures are certain, uncertain, or moderately certain. And on the horizontal axis, we have mapped the timeline for implementation of these measures, trying to understand whether a tariff measure is coming in this quarter or for next, and so on. And yes, in Q2, obviously, Q2 is going to be extremely crucial for the global economy. In Q2, obviously, we are at a phase where there is a 90-day pause on the reciprocal tariffs, and these measures give everyone a bit of breathing room. Countries have already started to fast track negotiations for the US. If you look at Japan, for example, Japan and the US began tariff talks on good terms. India is also trying to strike trade agreement with the US. So that's gaining momentum. Likewise, there are several other negotiations that are expected to initiate in Q2 and will continue. So we expect some sort of a positive turnaround from the current meltdown in the second half of the year. So these are some of the positives that may happen, in the due course. On the flip side, if you look at the flip side, fresh tariffs on pharma, semicon, on other sectors, etc., beyond auto and metals, potentially up to 5 to 15% may come. And if this happens, this would definitely impact key countries in Europe, India, Japan. So these are some of the countries which are going to be highly impacted by these kind of sectoral tariffs. But then even though these sectoral tariffs might be on the cards, there's still fair bit of an uncertainty around these tariffs, because US will likely review its inflation numbers, especially for April and May inflation data, carefully before deciding on further tariffs. Because obviously there are hints, and inflation is already sticky, and there are chances of inflation picking up pace, in these 2 months. So obviously the US government is expected to follow a cautious stance at the moment with regards to any more new tariff measures, etc. So what's happening is, one hand, we see that the Trump tariffs have become a little more aggressive, particularly for China, for Asia Pac. But on the other hand, we also see there are doors being opened for negotiations. So this is how we are evaluating the tariff-induced scenarios, the scenario analysis. And with that, let's move back to the previous slide where we had those overarching GDP numbers for global economy. and for advanced and the emerging economy. So these are some of the key growth numbers that we are looking at in the light of these potential tariff developments. And we are basically looking at GDP growth for the global economy for 2025 is forecast at 2.8%, down from 3.2 last year. And as you know, as conveyed earlier, we're not really uh, expecting any sort of recession for the US or for the world economy at the moment. We are not expecting the baseline GDP growth to be drastically lower than the last year's levels, because obviously countries are trying to actively engage with the US. There is also, ample room for governments to implement fiscal measures, at least when we look at the countries such as China, right? And also, yes, policy uncertainty is delaying new investment decisions, but we do expect that things should even out as the year progresses. And the second half, of course, businesses will be slightly better positions is what we are currently expecting. So that's the global economy GDP growth projection as a base case. And under a tariff intensification scenario, also, we are not really seeing a recessionary condition just as yet. We are looking at a 2.2 GDP growth, so slowdown under an intensification scenario. So obviously, domestic spending is still quite upbeat, especially when we look at major economies such as India, UAE, even China, right? So, that's definitely providing some support. Oil prices is low, and that is also supporting spending to some extent, So so net, I think we still like to believe that the world economy is resilient enough, and there is no recession that is on the cards just as yet. Moving over to the next slide, which I intend to present. Yes, so we can quickly look at this particular slide where what we have done is we have GDP growth expectations for key countries in the world. And you'll see in the slide growth rates for key countries laid for 2 years, 2024 and 2025. 2024 in light blue bars and 2025 in dark blue. And do note that the growth numbers that you see here on the screen are based on the base case only. So starting off with the US, we are looking at the growth numbers for the US to slide to 1.2% for this year. From what we saw, 2.8% for last year, obviously coming from all the policy uncertainty, which are kind of delaying fresh investment, etc. And as I was saying, April and May going to be really crucial when it comes to inflation, and the inflation readings are expected to pick up in the US, and that might leave very little room for the Fed to cut rates in June. So a high interest rate might linger for some more time. So yeah, US slowdown for sure. But thanks to the country's strong domestic demand, the growth is still much stronger when compared to other advanced markets like Germany, for example. If you look at Germany, the country we expect just about 0.2% or 0 to 0.2% average GDP growth rate for this year. Obviously, this is definitely some sort of a recovery. I won't say recovery, but slight better growth from last year, because obviously Germany had a really lackluster 2024. However, exports hinge on global trade policies, and tariffs on auto and on metals will definitely weigh on growth. And of course, we don't really expect a larger growth pickup for Germany or for the larger Eurozone. Let's also look at China and India as well. We are reducing China's 2025 growth forecast below 4%, obviously due to the ongoing trade war, etc. And this is definitely sluggish by China's historical standards, and it is impacting global average. However, when we look at China's fiscal stimuli packages, etc., so we expect that will provide some cushion to growth. India is definitely among the least vulnerable at this moment, and the domestic demand is also kind of providing some support. And India's growth is expected to remain robust at around 6.4 to 6.3 to 6.4 is what we are expecting at this stage. So yeah, that's about a brief snapshot of the macro outlook for key countries and for the world. And with that, I'd like to hand this back to Neha.
Thank you, Ritu. So we'll segue now into our industry perspective. So Joe, I'd like to invite you in here because I know the automotive industry is a little bit on the forefront of the trade wars in terms of exposure with your 25% auto tariffs. So I'm sure the audience would like to hear from you.
Thank you, Neha. Thank you, Ritu, for the macroeconomic insights and your perspectives on what the tariffs mean for the global economy. So when it comes to the automotive industry, the tariffs will have a broad-ranging impact across different regions and countries. Today, as a case study, we'll look at the North American automotive market. So if you see the North American automotive supply chain is heavily integrated and quite tightly knit with several automotive components, parts, and even finished goods moving across the three different borders. So we're looking at, in this slide, a journey of one such component, the capacitor. So if you look at step one, it's coming from Asia. A company based out of Colorado is importing it. And then a manufacturer in Michigan buys the capacitor and he sends it to Mexico, where it is placed in a circuit board. And in step four, if you see for import compliances, the circuit board is sent back to El Paso, Texas. And from there, it is moved back to Mexico, where it is assembled into an actuator. So now the actuator is a device which is used to fold the seats in our cars. So the assembled component is then sent to factories in the US and Canada to be integrated into the seats, and the seats themselves are moved to assembly factories nearby to be fitted into cars. So quite a long journey that a capacitor undertakes from step 1 to step 5.2, crossing the borders several times. So this is just one component. So there are several thousands of components which undertake similar journeys every day. So the proposed tariffs are going to be difficult and complex to implement. And if they are implemented seamlessly, then again, every time they cross the borders, the tariff-induced price hikes which are fed into these components will be quite severe. So we'll closely monitor this space and keep track of how this evolves in the coming months. But yeah, this sort of shows how complex it is in North America, especially the supply chain, and how difficult it will be to implement these tariffs. We'll keep a close eye on it. Next slide, please. Now, this slide looks at how Mexico is an indispensable part of the North American automotive supply chain. So a lot of the automakers and tier one suppliers have their bases in Mexico, from where they import their products into the United States. We've highlighted some automakers here. So if you look at Volkswagen, for example, 77% of all their vehicle imports into the US are manufactured in Mexico. So, that's one automaker who will be severely impacted. And if you look at companies like General Motors, Ford, and Toyota, you'll notice that they have significant production happening in the US already. But even then, if you look at General Motors, in 2024, they imported more than 700,000 finished vehicles into the US to be sold in the US market. So that's another maker who will have, automaker who will have significant impact because of the tariffs. Now, if you look at the electric vehicle space as well, most of these automakers have their suppliers based out of Mexico for batteries and electric vehicle components. So with tariffs being imposed on them again, the price of electric vehicles will also shoot up in the short to medium term. So yeah, that's a quick look at Mexico and how it's indispensable for the North American automotive industry. Next slide, please. So we're currently working on a report on Trump 2.0 policies and their impact on the automotive industry. So these are some of the initial observations that we made as we built that report. So when it comes to electric vehicles, as we just saw, the tariffs on components being imported, the the pause on electric vehicle infrastructure and the cancellation of EV incentives, while at the same time focusing on fossil fuels, will mean that electric vehicles will become less competitive in the market and lead to decline in their sales in the US. And when it comes to the supply chain as well, we'll observe that automakers will reassess their manufacturing bases in Mexico, Canada, and China, and they look for countries elsewhere which have not been touched by tariffs yet. So that will happen over the next few quarters. And all this is aimed at making the US self-sufficient in terms of manufacturing, but it will be a long drawn process for the automakers. So how will this affect them? Obviously, their sales will get affected. The prices of their vehicles will go up. So automakers will have to decide on how much they pass on, how much of the cost increase they pass on to their customers. So we feel that many automakers will absorb certain amount of cost, which will squeeze their margins in the short term. And in order to mitigate that loss in margins, they will look at areas where they can cut costs, especially in production. This could mean that they'll invest more in automation, adopt more lean processes to reduce waste, or come up with innovative designs which will rely less on imported components and parts. For example, if the price of steel gets expensive, they can probably focus on composite materials or other alternative materials to be used in non-critical areas. So that way, they can absorb more costs and than passing all these costs to the consumers. Now, consumers themselves, they are already faced with inflationary pressures, and when they see the price of new vehicles going up, they will turn their attention towards the used vehicle market, which in turn we feel will lead to the prices of used cars going up in the short to medium term in the US as well. So these are some of the initial observations from our end with regards to the automotive industry and the ongoing tariff wars. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Joe, for your perspective. I think it was interesting for everyone to see how trade happens cross-border, across North America. That was really interesting. Okay, Ram, if I could please invite you to comment on the industrials and the manufacturing perspective.
Yeah, thank you. It was great to hear about the automotive industry, particularly for manufacturing. Let this number sink in. Like for the US, the manufacturing accounts for 86% of the $1.3 trillion imports that we do from China, Canada, and Mexico. And the top industrial sectors that we believe would be the most impacted would be heavy machinery, which includes the likes of Caterpillar, John Deere, companies like them. High-value industrial components, because a lot of precision gears, for example, comes from Asian countries, and also auto components, which we saw earlier, the clear impact on the pricing and margin pressure, primarily because of commodities like steel and aluminum and the increase in tariffs on them. That's one of the main reasons on why there would be a big cost pressure, and then increased drive towards optimization of the footprint. And would this increase the US-based investment? Yes, we've seen a few, and we've seen quite a lot coming in. Roche today announced a $50 billion investment over the next 5 years, about $10 billion a year. And then other tech companies have also invested or have also announced investments in the US. But I think that's more of a long-term strategy. While tariffs, we look at it like a seesaw for the industrial market. There's definitely pressure on margins, but when the world got globalized, the supply chains got federated and really distributed. But it would take years and years to materially shift what we've carefully built and then look at reshoring strategies within the US. So with tougher immigration policies in the US and tougher tariff stance from the Trump 2.0 presidency, the market as we see it is more in a wait and watch mode. That's our take for the industrial market. There's still a lot of uncertainty and volatility around what's going to be implemented, what would be pulled back. So until the dust settles down, we would definitely see capital projects slow down, people looking at doing more with less, more with what they have today. So there might be an increase in operational expenditure spending to keep things running more and more well. So there would be more of a services-driven market in the short term. That's a growth that we're absolutely seeing. From a recommendation standpoint, I've put 4 things together. One is industrial margins. They would definitely companies need to keep a close eye on it, because margin preservation is something that's heavily sought after, as companies today will not compete on anything much, but it'll be competing on supply chain strengths and the diversity of the supply chain. Like, who are they sourcing it from? And what is the cost competitiveness that that supplier could bring to the table? And which countries that supplier coming from? The other recommendation that we wanted to offer was retooling the manufacturing sites. Like some of the leaders that we're seeing in this space, they're doubling down on investing in automation technologies. For the long term, at least, when you look at it, automation does reduce the unit cost of production. And that is something that you could invest in for long term, from a digital standpoint, from an automation standpoint, and supply chain control tower technologies. Some of the tools that we've seen being sought after for companies come to us and ask for recommendations. It's more on the lines of product lifecycle management, and pivoting from PLM to digital thread aspects, because you're able to tie in a complete view of data structure from what goes into a product assembly to the financial data to the who you're sourcing those components to build the product and assemble the product from, so that you could look at alternative designs, alternative suppliers, and simulate before you actually physically implement that in the real world. So PLM, digital threads, configure price code tools for understanding the impact of tariffs, AI tools for understanding ontology, like interconnections between supply chain, because who you're sourcing from will have a direct impact and a ripple effect across your value chain of manufacturing. So that is something that we're seeing as investing in automation and digital and supply chain control tower technologies. The third one is kind of obvious: leverage a China plus one strategy. Look at countries beyond China, India, Vietnam. Vietnam also has an excessive tariff according to the current structure. So that's why I've looked at India and other low-cost tariff regions. Particularly for custom manufacturing or custom parts manufacturing, small-scale manufacturing. One recommendation that I wanted to offer for industrial companies is double down on NPDs, like develop new products. This is the time for you to look at NPD or retool existing product lines, profitable product lines, with alternative product design or alternative supplier strategies. That's kind of looking at tariff re-engineering in a way. But particularly for custom manufacturing or small-scale prototyping, when you want to do it, you don't really have to depend on your own workforce. Look at digital factory networks. One of the companies that comes to my name is, which recently got acquired by Misumi in Japan. It's a company called Fictive, and they have a digital manufacturing platform. They've got different manufacturing networks. So plug into them so that you could understand who you could get your custom parts manufactured from, and avoid the tariff situation, and maybe not its entirety, but at least offset it by a little bit, compared to having or dipping in on your own supply chain network if they are in a high tariff nation. So that's kind of like a quick view on how we see the industrial market panning out and what kind of roadmap you could look at and pathways to wade through this scenario. Thank you, Neha. Back to you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Ram. I think it was really interesting for us to see some of the outcomes and the impact of the responses coming up out of different industries. I think the wait and watch approach perhaps is not something we're seeing necessarily across industrials only. I think businesses globally are waiting to see whether this is going to be a year-long situation of tariff wars. So we do see a lot of businesses waiting to see whether we're going to see a lot more policy announcements or whether this is just going to be for the next couple of months and respond accordingly. Okay, great. So moving ahead, what does Trump 2.0 and trade wars 2.0, more importantly, mean in terms of some of the key economic and business outcomes for 2025? So if you look over to the next slide, we have some of our high frequency indicators that we monitor and we know are of interest to businesses as well in terms of growth, in terms of inflation, commodity prices and the like. So this slide captures some of our forecasts from earlier in Jan. You'll see under the Jan 2025 tab, and you'll see how these forecasts have changed over the past couple of weeks. We've continued to update and revise them based on tariff announcements. So starting with global growth, for example, we definitely entered the world economy in 2025 on a strong footing. The change in US presidency, of course, changed a lot of that. So that being said, we are forecasting, like Ritu had said, a global growth slowdown to about 2.8%. A global recession is not on the cards for us. And I think this also pretty much aligns with, I know IMF numbers are coming out and latest announcements by the IMF as well don't necessarily outline a global recession, but they do envision a moderate slowdown. And I think it's the uncertainty factor in particular, which is causing a lot of slowdown in terms of investments, putting on pause a lot of investment plans over the next couple of months. Like I mentioned, businesses are waiting to see how the entire tariff plan structure materializes over the next couple of weeks to months. If we're looking at inflation, so you can see that we have revised our inflation forecast upwards to about 5.5%, which is only but expected. We're not expecting a drastic rise in inflation. And this is also simulating what we'd seen during the last round of trade wars during 2018 to about 2019, 2020. Growth dipped, but not drastically. Similarly, we saw a few decimal points of inflationary pressure rises, but it's not going to be that large to the extent that we've seen over the past 2-3 years with the wars and the like, but there will be a couple of inflationary pressures. I think most importantly, what does this mean in terms of central bank policy announcements? So if you look at recent news which has been emerging, we've seen certain central banks now sort of moving to pivoting towards a rate cut policy, whether we're talking about the European Central Bank or New Zealand Central Bank. So you're looking at central banks that are sort of advancing to cut these interest rates because they prioritize cushioning the GDP growth against some of the inflationary pressures that might be coming in. When we're talking about oil forecasts, you can see that we've revised our oil forecasts again down to about $65 per barrel. So it's quite common that one of the key factors that's causing lower oil prices, of course, are the US-China trade wars in itself. Any potential truce when it comes to, let's say, Russian-Ukraine peace deal or a truce, you could see a little bit more Russian oil coming back online later this year in the event that this is finalized. And that would, again, push some of your prices down further. So moving over to the next slide. So as we know, any trade wars 2.0, or like we've seen any of the tectonic events over the past couple of years, whether it's the trade wars, the pandemic, they all come attached with risks. But at the same time, they create a lot of structural differences and change in terms of how the world economy and business functions. So if we look at some of the key risks and growth opportunities, some of the risks, of course, you would see are a lot more short-term driven. It's only expected that there will be a growth slowdown. There will be weakened external and exports demand when you're monitoring exports and imports figures, and there will be a little bit of inflation happening in terms of when you're talking about risks. But most importantly, what do we see as some of the growth opportunities arising from tariff wars 1.0? So I think earlier Ram and perhaps Joe had alluded to China +1 supply chain strategies, and we do see this continuing to intensify. So it was during trade wars 1.0, in fact, that was in the 2018-19 period, that China +1 supply chain strategy sort of rose to the limelight, whereby businesses would continue to maintain some presence in China, of course, because it's such a manufacturing hub, but at the same time pivot into newer markets, be it a Vietnam, or a Mexico. And I think Ram is right in, a Vietnam or in India. And I think Ram is right at this juncture to sort of highlight India a little bit more, because our reciprocal tariff level is on the lower level. And most importantly, India is fast tracking a US-India trade deal a lot more faster. So I think the +1 countries, which will be an advantage, are those that have a combination of lower tariff levels, as well as those that are able to negotiate faster trade deals with the US. Secondly, we are going to be seeing a lot of diversification. That theme of supply chain diversification is, of course, going to continue. A lot more regionalization of trade. We can see this happening within Asia Pacific itself, for example. So if you're talking about Japan, China, and South Korea, we see officials from these three countries having recently met to cooperate on trade. In fact, free trade talks between these three countries were stalled for about 5 years, but have now reaccelerated. So you can see that pivot towards regionalization of trade, where some of the production perhaps can pivot from North America to these countries, which are a little bit more entrenched when it comes to free trade agreements. Moving over to the next slide. So we have covered a little bit on industry-specific resilience strategies through Trade Wars 2.0. But when we're talking a little bit general across the board, what are some of the strategies that companies should adopt to sort of weather Trade Wars 2.0, and more importantly, gain a competitive edge? So you're not necessarily reacting to trade wars, but you're proactively sort of responding to how the news evolves. So I think one of the key things to do, of course, is to engage a lot when it comes to scenario planning and stress testing across your supply chain. So whether that means identifying points of pressure for your specific supply chain and responding accordingly. Like Ram had mentioned, of course, production, investment decisions, those are much longer. Those involve a lot more time. But when it comes to perhaps responding from target markets to look at for sales and exports, those are more of short-term pivots. So for example, one way to go would be when we see an India-US trade deal progressing, or when we see a US-Japan trade deal progressing, we see these set of countries sort of at the front of the line for arriving at favorable trade deal negotiations. And over the next couple of weeks and months, if we do see a free trade deal emerging from these regions, even a phase 1 trade deal for these regions, it would obviously mean that exporting out of, say, an India or a Japan is a lot more cost competitive, export competitive, compared to, let's say, exporting out of a China. So would that mean that your supply chains and your production in these locations is capable of responding and producing and exporting more out of some of these regions? And I think one of the points that's not mentioned on this slide is when you have trade wars and inflationary driven pressures, it's of course your middle class consumers that are a little bit more sensitive to inflation. Whereas if you move higher up the value chain, whether you're talking about your consumers of more luxury goods and high-end goods, that's of course a little bit more resistant to inflationary pressures and the like. And that's what we've seen in the past. Demand for premium segments typically tends to go up a little bit more when we're in an inflation-driven cycle or when we're in a growth slowdown cycle. So that's potentially something for companies to focus on in terms of a pivot when it comes to the marketing and production side of things. So moving on. So that brings us to the close of our discussion for today. And before we move, we will be segueing into the Q&A shortly. But what we've done is we've designed a sort of a high-impact half-day workshop. As you can see from the title, it's called Navigating Trump 2.0 Trade Policy Shifts, Resilient Supply Chains, because amidst all the tariff-related volatility that businesses are having to contend with. So to give you an overview, it's sort of a 4-stage workshop. It'll consist of an in-detail executive briefing, visioning scenarios of what you can expect from a macroeconomic as well as an industry level and what that means for your client business, data-driven risk heat maps, and most importantly, what should some of your go-to response strategies be amidst trade wars. So the workshop is designed to sort of better predict some of the tariff outcomes, some of the visioning scenarios, and help when it comes to the demand forecasting abilities, and most importantly, future-proofing your business through Trade Wars 2.0. Before we head into our Q&A, I think some of the key takeaways that we've been seeing in terms of economic and industry transformations that we've covered today. I'd say on the economic side of things, we are receiving a lot of news, but sometimes it's important to distill through that. So no recession fears on the cards just as yet. The probability is rising, but we're not forecasting a recession just as yet. Same on the inflation side of things. So I don't believe it's cause for alarm just as yet. We've seen references, of course, to a lot of supply chain reorientation. So maybe over the longer term, yes, it does make sense to maybe invest a lot more in the US, but we're going to be seeing that pivot increasingly, whether it means a Mexico plus one supply chain strategy, perhaps it might be a China plus India supply chain strategy, and countries that are lower on the tariff rung and countries that accelerate trade deals. They're probably going to be go-to investment hotspots over the next couple of months. So we are going to be seeing a continued realignment of trade and supply chains, which is pretty much what we've been seeing since the start of 2019 trade wars. So with that in mind, feel free to submit your questions. I know that we have been receiving some of them. So we will get started. Okay. So the first question, what do you mean by US's strong domestic demand? How does it impact chances of a recession in the US?
Sure, I can take that and hand it to the panel in case my fellow speakers want to provide some perspective. So, strong domestic demand, of course, refers to robust spending in the US, both coming from the consumers as well as, when we say domestic demand, it also includes government spending. So of course, we've seen how, spending has remained a key driver for the US's economic growth. So that's what we meant by domestic demand being strong in the US. However, obviously, we see new tariffs, right? Retaliatory tariffs, etc., coming into the US. So that has introduced inflationary pressures and increased uncertainty in the US. And this has also led to, I think, a decline in the consumer confidence. So it has definitely increased risks of an US recession in 2025, because obviously monetary policy, if you see, that may also stay elevated for some time. But however, we are not really expecting any full year contraction. We're only expecting a slowdown in the US, maybe a near zero growth or a negative growth for a quarter, or a shallow recession for only a quarter, etc. Only for 1 or 2 quarters of near zero or shallow recession at this stage, and not a full year contraction.
Thanks for that, Ritu. This is more on the mobility side of things. How do you see automakers or OEMs responding to some of these tariffs? Joe, I think
Yes, Neha, I can answer that. Yeah, we've been monitoring how the automakers have been reacting to the tariffs. These are still early days, but we see that different automakers are reacting differently. For example, Volkswagen has paused imports into the US. JLR has again paused shipments to the US from the European factories. But there are companies like General Motors who are considering moving some of their production from Mexico to the US. For example, they're thinking about moving their truck production from Mexico to the US. Honda is also considering moving their the production of their Honda Civic hybrid from Mexico to the US, whereas companies like Volvo are trying to expand their current production bases in the US. So these are still very early days, a lot of wait and watch at this point in time. But yes, I think as Ritu mentioned, Q2 would be critical, and I think that's when we'll see further concrete sort of strategies evolving and automakers reacting to these tariffs.
Interesting, Joe. Thanks for that. What kind of effect do you foresee towards subcontinent Indo-Pak, which I think is India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and a couple of other countries in view of the current US trade war? So I'd like to maybe just start that off and hand it over to you all if anything else. So I think in terms of India in particular, because of course we're perhaps the largest economy in the region, we entered the tariff wars in a relatively sort of like a mixed bag, because on the one hand, we were moving towards a free trade deal, but on the other hand, we were also on the target list of, let's say, the 15 top countries that contribute towards the highest US trade deficit. So it's no surprise that India was slapped with tariffs as high as 26% when April 2nd came around. I think what's really important for India that we see in the news, even as of today, we do see a lot of progress towards fast-tracking a US-India trade deal, which might mean concessions for India in some regard. But I do feel that if India is able to successfully negotiate a trade deal or even a phase one trade deal over the next couple of months, that really positions India in a strong way to capture some of those investments, which might be, let's say, going out of a China or let's say going out of a Vietnam over the next couple of months. For the rest of the countries in the subcontinent, I think some of them, if we're talking about like a Bangladesh or a Sri Lanka, they also had pretty high tariff levels of about, I think about 30% or higher. But as we know, right now for the next 90 days, all these tariff levels have been rolled back to 10%. So it's sort of a wait and watch thing. So for example, if a country like Bangladesh is not able to secure a favorable trade position, not necessarily a trade deal, and if the US decides to go ahead with reciprocal tariffs on all the remaining 90 countries, then you will see textile exports, for example, getting hampered because it becomes the cost competitiveness angle pretty much comes down.
Just to chime in there on that perspective about India and the overall SAARC nations, etc. Of course, India, rightly said Neha, so we do see the resilience coming in from that country. However, we also have to keep in mind that obviously that's just a baseline case, but if in case fresh tariffs on pharma in particular implemented, then that may alter some of these numbers, because I believe US accounts for about 30 to 40, if I'm not wrong, of India's total exports, pharma exports to the US. So that's something that we need to, watch out for. And with regards to the other countries, rightly said, yes, I think for Pakistan, Sri Lanka, these countries are heavily influenced, or their trade with China is a lot more. So of course, if China is slowing down even more, so that will impact these countries even more. And also, I think with regards to Pakistan, the Pak China corridor, so investments towards that infrastructure, big ticket investments, that might get slightly hampered in this year.
Rightly said, Ritu. Great. So I think we're at the top of the hour. So we will conclude shortly, but I do hope that you have received some key critical insights that you can take away from today's session on what to on the impact and what to expect over the next couple of months.